To quote from another awesome creative work, now for something completely different. When we were thinking of this conference and its theme, we decided that actually a really important aspect of what is intellectual property reform is how reform and intellectual property disputes more generally are understood by the public at large, and also by policymakers and lawyers and other specialists who engage in it. And so we decided that we really need to have members of the media to have a conversation with them about how these issues are talked about and how they report on them. And we're really honored to have some great representatives from the media who have been reporting on IP issues for a very long time. And are widely read. Unfortunately, Andrew Orlowsko from the Register became ill, so he was unable to join us. But we still have, to my immediate left, Richard Lloyd, who's North American editor of Intellectual Asset magazine. And then continuing down the line, Tony Dutra, who's legal editor of Bloomberg Bna, and then last, but never least, Rob Levine, who is a freelance journalist and author and former executive editor of Billboard. And so this panel is going to be structured a little differently, since these individuals, first of all, thank you for willing to speak with us. You are usually the ones on the other side, so we appreciate us shining the light on you for once. And since they are reporters and not academics, lawyers, and TJ Stiles, who can speak at length about their insights about the world and their experiences. We're going to run this a little bit differently, more as kind of a back and forth question and answer, and we'll have opportunities, of course, for the audience to ask questions as well. So I'm just going to kick it off with an initial question to each of them, and they'll just give a short statement in response to that initial question, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions, and then I'll open up to the audience, and then we'll come back and continue a dialogue maybe between and amongst ourselves and with the audience as well. So my initial question, just kind of kicking it off to each of you, and I'd like each of you to answer it because I'm sure each of you has a slightly different perspective or answer to this question, is, and so in covering intellectual property law and policy over the years, what has been the biggest change in the past 7 to 10 years in how you have seen intellectual property issues being covered in the media? So I'll just start immediately to my left with Richard.
Great. Thank you, Adam. I must say it is very strange to be the one being asked questions of, so I must start by saying this is all, of course, on very deep background this afternoon. I'm not going to duck the question, but I should point out to begin with that I've been in my current role for a little over 3.5 years, which is actually my first sort of job reporting on the IP market. But as a journalist, I, of course, have plenty of opinions, so I'm happy to kick off. I think a lot of the same forces that are affecting media in general, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, affect IP media and how we report as a whole. So, for example, the proliferation of sources, new news sites, blogs, academic works, all sources of material for potential stories, which is absolutely fantastic. The rise of social media as well, and therefore how we communicate as a sort of stakeholder community and how we try to reach other parts of the broader community outside of the IP world. Again, that's a huge plus, but of course there are disadvantages, minuses to that. And one of the things that's always struck me as I've walked into this world, this slightly new world for me, is and I walked in sort of early 2014, so a little after the Innovation Act had been passed in the House, was the level of division and the level of disagreement and the way that that actually manifested itself in the media as well, which I continue to find actually quite shocking. And you can see that again, you can see that on media, and you can see that on different sites that obviously have different perspectives, different narratives that they like to sort of get out there. When I was thinking about this question, I also talked to my editor who's in the UK, and he's reported on this market for probably about 30 years. And we had a little email back and forth, and I got some of his sort of thoughts. And the one thing that he actually reflected on was the degree to which IP is now reported by the mainstream media. which is a huge change in the last 7 to 10 years. You never saw it on the front pages in the business pages, let alone on the front pages of sort of major newspapers. And of course, that all changed with smartphone litigation and has continued more recently with the patent reform debate. Now, I think generally it's a plus that these big, important issues are reported in more very well-read media outlets. But again, it does carry some problems, disadvantages. My editor referred to the problem around particular narratives or studies that get out there that capture the imagination, particularly in the mainstream media, that can also become quite damaging in the conversations that happen around IP. Now, it can make our jobs a little tougher to actually determine, okay, well, what is actually are the facts here, what is true? And it also leads to more controversy, but generally, as a journalist, I can't object to that. We'd have a lot less to write about if everyone agreed. So I'll leave my comments to that, and then perhaps we can sort of get into more of it later.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Tony?
So I'll start by saying all of the above and a little bit more. I will start with my personal story, and I believe it is representative of what's happened along the lines of when Richard came in 2014. I have been doing this for 10 years. I joined a company 10 years ago called BNA, stood for Bureau of National Affairs. My audience was what I would call patent law stakeholders. 95+% of them were lawyers. I looked back and I saw when I wrote about the Bilski case that the Federal Circuit wrote about in 2009, and it was 4,400 words, which is roughly 8 pages, of which brings me to the point that it used to go out in print, and people would take this print version and they would read it from cover to cover, and they would get a grounding of a lot of things in intellectual property. Mostly I wrote about patent, but there would be a lot of other stuff in there. And I would be able to think about the opinion that I was writing about for a day or two before I wrote about it. And nobody complained because they were waiting for the print version. In 2011, 2 things changed. One is mostly what Richard talks about, and that is the new media changed the way we write, changed how we present the information. The other thing that happened, which is also along the lines of what Richard's main interest is Bloomberg bought Bna. In case you know Bloomberg only as a news channel, what you should know is that Michael Bloomberg got his money from putting terminals on Wall Street brokers' desks. They present information to them, letting them know what stocks to buy and what industries to care about. So in 2014, Bloomberg came to BNA and said, you are now writing stories for the terminal as well as for your patent law stakeholder community. That changed the way the presentation had to come out in terms of content. I now know the patent law stakeholder community cared about issues, about theories, about legal doctrines. The Wall Street market cared about winners and losers. And the divide that Richard talked about is now that winners and losers want to be heard more often. I have to quote winners and losers, whereas before I quoted other lawyers who had comments about the theory. The other things that really mattered is that when Wall Street cares, they care about knowing information immediately. So I had to give them, whereas I could wait 2 days before, right now I have to send out, if the Federal Circuit comes out with an opinion at 11 o'clock, I have to have a 3-paragraph breaking news thing by noon, and I have to have my story done on the full opinion by 5. And it has to be 700 words or less, not 4,400 words, because it's going to be presented on somebody's phone, not on a piece of paper. What that means is that the topics that you can possibly discuss are limited. The nuance that you possibly could have put in a 4,400-word story is no longer, well, it's hard, let's say it. And if I have to appeal to lawyers and people who are going to make use of the value of the information and how to pick stocks, I have to give them information in different order. They have to be able to figure out in the first 3 paragraphs whether to buy a stock. I'll leave it at that. I'm not making judgment comments on any of it. I'm telling you how my world changed and how I believe the rest of the IP media world has changed.
Rob.
Well, as a journalist, I'm going to be a pain in the ass and give you 2 changes. The first change is that, I wrote a book called Free Ride starting in 2010, and at the time, the media coverage of IP issues, I'm talking about copyright, I should say, I've never covered patents. The coverage of copyright issues was very different from what it had ever been. The 1976 Copyright Act, which was so fundamentally important for what anyone in copyright, anyone in the media does, the total mainstream media coverage was a half a page in Time magazine. 1/2 page in Time, mainstream media coverage. It was covered a lot in trades. I think the Blurred Lines case probably got more space than that in Time magazine. This stuff became mainstream. One of the unfortunate aspects is that it became mainstream at a time when most mainstream reporters are doing more with less. I view myself as someone who, I'm not a lawyer. I try hard. Sometimes I screw up. Sometimes I get it right. Most of the time it's decent. It's easy to, a lot of you have helped me through this, and I appreciate it. I have the advantage, I write a couple stories a week. A lot of people are writing a couple stories an hour. It's really hard. The more recent change is that the entire narrative, if you think about copyright, around copyright in Silicon Valley was one of good guys and bad guys, the mean old media companies against these nice kids from Silicon Valley. They're so cute in their hoodies. What do you have against them? And the world really changed. At some point in the last year, I don't know exactly why, I don't think it had to do with copyright directly, but it has to do with how we see Silicon Valley, and it's going to have a profound change going forward. Someone in this audience just sent me a story today from the New York Times about how Silicon Valley was getting a bad reputation. It ran, I think, on the front page today. I only saw it on my phone. And there's another page in the New York Times opinion section Sunday. This is a great headline. I quote, "Silicon Valley is not your friend." And as someone who's been covering this for a while, I think my response would be like, no shit. I mean, even if you like these companies, and I like a lot of what they do, I don't have anything against them personally, they're in it to make money. That's what companies do. Of course they're not your friend. But this is a big change. The Times wouldn't have run that story 2 years ago. I'm not one of these self-flagellating journalists, but there is a certain amount of groupthink in the media. I don't think, there's no sinister conspiracy. Most newspapers, I can tell you firsthand, they're not capable of organizing a conspiracy. They can barely run a newspaper. But a lot of journalists, they talk to other journalists, just like lawyers talk to other lawyers. The narrative builds on itself. This is turning, and it's turning really hard. And I think some of you on the inside may underestimate it. I live in Park Slope, where I think most people think GMU is a public radio station. And 2 years ago, I would talk to people, and they'd think I was crazy. What do you care about Facebook knows your personal information? What could go wrong? Really? Who would have thought? Yeah, well, anybody. And now people ask me, you didn't use Uber. You didn't use Uber before anyone else didn't use Uber. I don't know what that means. It's really changing. It's changing in the mainstream. It's changing on the left. It's changing on the right. Leading lawyers and law professors, by the nature of what you do, you think very logically what happens in law, what happens in court, what happens in statute. that's how you have to think, it's what you do. But some of the media it's a little of that. It's some of the public mood. You guys are probably less sensitive to that because you're covering more for a professional audience. I cover some for a professional audience. The public mood still affects that, and the public mood is really changing. I don't know when it happened, but it's going to start becoming very different.
So I want to pick up on one of the themes that seems to run throughout your initial remarks before we potentially open up for questions and give you guys an opportunity to respond. But that you have had changes in audience, an expansion in the audience, which has come along with, at the same time, an expansion in the distribution mechanisms through the electronic sources of media as sources, both and as distributors. So, and at the same time, as Tony mentioned, things have sped up. So expansion of audience, speeding up. Tony mentioned less nuance as a result of that. Can't dig into the issues as much. So what other areas do you see that this is impacting your ability to report on what are very complicated issues? Patent disputes, legal patent disputes are very complicated, and as are copyright issues. So how are you seeing this impacting your ability to report on these issues?
Well, I'll just take a slightly different angle to it. For us, a big source of our expansion, so most of our readers are in the US. We're a UK headquartered publication, but the US is by far our biggest audience, not surprisingly. But obviously, a lot of our growth, as it is for a lot of companies, come from Asia. So although I am the only IAM journalist in the US, we have a Mandarin speaker in Hong Kong, and we have another English speaker in Hong Kong. And so, and I write, when I'm writing a story, I write for the IP executive in Tokyo or Shenzhen, who might not, it will know some of the nuances of the US market, it will know what an IPR is, but may not understand everything that was in the Second Innovation Act, for example. So I've always got that in my mind, and that to me, that for us is sort of what expansion of the market means and expanding audience means.
Have you had a harder time reporting on it, given also the constraints of having to quickly write or write just blog posts instead of writing lengthier think pieces?
So I'm a little behind Tony on this. It is coming. The day is coming, I can feel it, when my editor will be demanding, like Tony's, 500 words in an hour. That happens less for us, just because there are people like Tony, and people at Reuters, and other news organizations that we know have the resources to turn around a story much more quickly. So I do have a bit more of the benefit. If a Fed Circuit decision comes down, there's a good chance that my deadline will be 10 a.m. the next morning. And that means that I can reach out to you and other people in the audience and say, what do you think about this? And then get some of those nuances that Tony can't necessarily get in his first sort of 700 words.
Yes. So Tony, by the way, I enjoy tremendously and read all of your 750-word notices that I get through my email server via email on when these decisions come out. But do you want? Can you expand on this a little bit as well?
Well, I will add a new, I guess it's a requirement, but when you're suggesting winners and losers, data needs to be there to back it up. It is important to identify an industry, and if I identify an industry, I identify the size of the industry and the players in it. It is important if Judge Gilstrap is going to lose a bunch of cases to identify how many cases he's going to lose and what industries in particular are going to be forced to go to Delaware or the Northern District of California. So the market is demanding more in terms of, I guess the economic consequences is the broader term for it, but it's really more show us, give us something concrete that we can build on. And yes, we understand that the doctrine of equivalence was involved in this, and we'll let you have a couple of paragraphs on describing the doctrine of equivalence to us. But please tell us how many cases turn on the doctrine of equivalence. So you're just getting into the point where you now have to provide support for the economic consequence or the broadness of a particular event.
And Rob, do you?
One of the things I think, I cover copyright a bit for Billboard. It's in a very specific way, as it affects the music business and mostly, music publishing. One of the difficult things about the internet for me is that sometimes you're writing for a specific audience, but another audience is reading it. Billboard's essentially a trade magazine that covers the music business. But they also, they reprint a lot of stuff on the internet. A lot of people are interested in the music business, so a much wider audience reads it. So, if I'm just using this as an example, in the blurred lines case, somebody reads it, and 9 out of 10 people read, oh, that's interesting, here's what it means for my clients, here's what it might mean for future litigation. And then, somebody, you'll get one comment that's like, man, I hate Robin Thicke. And that's the funny side of it, but it's often hard to know how much do you explain stuff when you have an audience, a primary audience that doesn't need it explained, a secondary audience that might. It can get really very tricky. And it's interesting because, also I think for one, I think this is true of you guys as well, tell me, but like, magazines like Billboard, specialty publications like BNA, I don't know if you'd consider it a trade or a specialty, a newsletter, a terminal service. I think we have a lot of influence on the mainstream media indirectly. Reporters who cover the music business for the Times and the Journal, or smaller publications, they read Billboard. I don't, should they? That's another question. But you have some influence when you're covering it for insiders, and it gives us a position of responsibility that's interesting. I try to honor that, because as more people cover it, they tend to draw conclusions that are, well, it's not wrong, but it's a bit out of context. There's a lot of mainstream publications have told me that, if the gay family wins the case in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, no one's going to be able to make music again. It's going to have a massive effect on songwriters. Will it have an effect on songwriters? Yeah, maybe. People will still make music. The importance, it's easier to be accurate than it is to sort of put things in context and assess their importance. And I think that's very tricky.
Do you guys have an initial response to that, or should we kick it out to the audience? Does anyone have any questions from the audience? Here's your chance to sure, Gary. Please wait for the the microphone so that everyone can hear you.
I've noticed a trend in the media. The media has become really negative about patents, and I would like to know what the source of that negativity is. It's actually dragging down the value of patents in general. And I think part of the problem is the media's behavior vis-a-vis patents. And it's very confusing to me why the media would be complicit in this kind of behavior.
I think that's an overstatement, and the media right
I'm
now.
not talking about you guys in general.
Well,
I'm talking about, sensationalism, the newspapers putting out things about patent trolls and things like that. It's getting ridiculous.
The media, in that sense, followed Congress. Congress followed Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley found the word trolls and loved it. And Chairman Goodlatte thought, that's how I can sell the Innovation Act, which he hasn't been able to do. And then John Oliver liked it too, and he did a story on it, and then other people in the media said everyone else is using the word trolls, so we can use the word trolls. But I'll go the other way on it, in that somebody somewhere in 2014 or 15 loved the word death squads. Death squads at the PTAB. And then all of a sudden, everyone was saying how the PTAB is, the judges themselves are biased and they're death squads. And now you can get death squads in the New York Times. The death squad quote, just as a historical fact, was made by Judge Rader when only one case had been decided at the PTAB. He wasn't talking about them as the place where patents go to die. He was talking about what is now in front of the Supreme Court, which is the dichotomy between having half of the office granting property rights and the other half of the office taking them away. So it's happening on both sides. The media is split, as Richard would said. The divide is pretty harsh, and it gets ramped up, it seems, almost not weekly, but every time Congress decides to think again about legislation, it gets ramped up.
If you're talking about the mainstream media, I can address this. You know, one of the things, have you ever tried to fit the word non-practicing entity in a headline? And there's a point to this, which is like, you know, this is very, you're specialists, so it's tough to get in front of this audience and say this. If you're writing about this stuff, and I have a bit for the Times, for the Journal, for a mainstream newspaper, you have to simplify it without oversimplifying it. That's really hard. It's harder than I think a lot of you might realize. I'm not excusing some people that get it wrong, but it is tricky. One way to make a complicated story understandable is to find a narrative. Sometimes the narrative is a little too simple. Trolls is a very simple narrative. And one of the problems is that sometimes there's not a counter-narrative. One of the reasons I like this conference is because I didn't realize this was true until Adam told me. Every year, there's someone who's a creator who's not an attorney. TJ Stiles is a great counter-narrative. It's very easy to say, oh, those record companies, they're suing grandparents. But if you talk to the average author, I'm sympathetic because I am one. Yeah, people live on this money. It's not my second mortgage I'm paying with my book royalties. It's my rent. I don't even have a first mortgage. You know, it's not my car payment. It's my bicycle repair. I'm doing fine. I live in Park Slope. I don't need a car. But like, it's. I don't mean to fetch, but it's like you need another. Some of the time, someone will say, "Well, that's not true," but there's also a sense of telling a story. I don't. Good reporters see beyond that, but even with good reporters, you know, you've got a lot of people at smaller newspapers who are doing 5 stories a day online. I do a couple stories a week. If you're doing 5 blog posts a day, it's really hard. You tend to default to simple narratives. That's terrible, and I don't know the answer to that. But as long as you have that problem to deal with, where people are defaulting to simple narratives, you need your own narrative. And I think that's something that's really important. You don't only tell the story of the person getting sued. Tell the story of the creator who's not making a living, or the inventor who's not making a living in your case, because that is a way to respond.
All right. By the way, this is, I mean, what Tony and Rob are saying, I mean, it's well known within DC, right? The classic cliche, if you're explaining in DC, you're losing, right? I mean, and if so, this is something that we have to be aware of, right? If you're having to explain to someone what a non-practicing entity is, you're losing to the guy saying troll. I mean, that's just a fact.
Yes.
So there was a question over here, so.
Hi, I'm Sasha Mossam with the R Street Institute. And Robert, I just want to say your work in music licensing about 2 years ago was fantastic. I had
Thank
just
you.
entered the policy world at that time, so I used your pieces to kind of introduce me. So I want to say thank you again for your fantastic journalism and work.
Thank you.
My question, I work in policy, but I also work in federal affairs. So my job is essentially to take these really complex issues of copyright and balance copyright reform, translate them to lawmakers. That's difficult, to say the least. to opening up to the floor, you were talking about simple narratives. Do you have any resources? How do you guys approach the matter? So when I go speak to these lawmakers with my white papers, I'm a former Hill staffer myself, so I remember this problem really well. And I want to say, X is happening, we would like you to do Y because of Z, and not make it too complex so I can't get my message out within the 30-minute period I have with the overworked staffer. Tips, tricks, things to read for the audience?
I always hope the policy, when I say simple narratives, I always hope the policymakers have an appetite for more complexity. Yeah, and I just to cover myself, so to say, I try to do better than that. I think a lot of people try to do better than that. When I say simple narratives, I'm not saying that that's the ideal. It's never my goal, but you have to realize that people are overworked. They're busy. Trolls is easy. I think one way is to get people, depending on the staffer and their understanding of it, it's hard to say, is to get their people who it affects on the ground. People who meet with creators from their district tend to be sympathetic to creators. I don't think like unduly so, but it's easier to say that, you don't hear that much of this anymore, but people said for a long time, well, artists can just go on tour. It's great if you're 25, but my back would give out if I was in a van for a month. Maybe not. Maybe I've got another 10 years. But you know what I mean? Like, if you talk to people, you have a sense of how they live and how it affects them on the ground. Like, people who say we don't need copyright, listen to TJ Styles. It's harder to say to him than it is to someone who talks about it in a more abstract way. I don't think that's the answer, but maybe that helps somewhat.
Richard or Tony, do you guys?
Well, I was just going to say, whenever I struggle with a story, it is invariably because I haven't spoken to enough people, I haven't read enough source material, so unfortunately it does go back to the point you do need more time. If I'm writing a longer article, and hopefully I do have that time to actually, to call people, speak to them, get a wider view, wider range of views. But then I think you can also go back to some of the sort of journalism 101 about, what is the story, who it is affecting, how and why, and take an inverted pyramid and say, okay, in my first 2 paragraphs, I've got to get 80 to 90% of the story across because I have to sell it to the reader. And I think, you always got to understand who are you trying to reach with the information that you've got. And if you start with those, that can be sort of, that's quite sort of simplistic, but if you start with those principles, they definitely help.
All right, so I saw Jenny over here, and then we'll go back to this side. So, right there, yeah.
So I would think that continuing to sell the same narrative over and over again is not a very interesting thing for a reporter to do. This isn't my field, so I'm curious why it isn't easier and more alluring for a reporter to push that counter-narrative and say, here's a way of looking at this situation that is different from the way every other reporter is doing it. So the question is, why do you think reporters are so much trend followers in this? Why isn't it easier to push the counter-narrative? And do you have any advice for us, in the practicing world, if we have a counter-narrative, how do we sell that to a reporter and package it and make it easy for them to run with it? Because I have to confess some degree of confusion as to why there's this sort of groupthink. It's great that everybody is finally getting the message that Silicon Valley isn't your friend, and that's the new narrative. Why did it take so long to get there?
First, I want to disown the idea that I'm pushing any narrative. We don't use the word trolls. We don't use death squads. Well, people get quoted. We quote people who use those words, but not by our design. It is extremely difficult to explain non-practicing entity, and we are still working on how we identify particular people who bought patents and are asserting them. We will use different terms. Non-practicing entity still sounds to me pejorative almost. Frankly, efficient infringement sounds pejorative to me. And so we try to find ways to identify why people do the actions that they do in either trying to assert and enforce their patents or trying to defend against the assertion. The narrative gets out there through bloggers and tweeters, and they're counterbalanced by other bloggers and tweeters who think the opposite thoughts. I wanted to say earlier, I didn't say it, I didn't chime in, I don't worry about Congress that much because there's a balance in Congress. There are patent owners in Congress, and they counter the narratives of the patent troll supporters in Congress. What I worry about is more what Rob said about is the public is turning, and the public, because the public likes words like trolls. It doesn't like words like non-practicing entities or patent assertion entity. And at some point, that's got to switch. And all I can say is I am probably unable to do that because I have too limited an audience. We're a subscription service, so I have too limited an audience to do it, but I'm trying.
Just on that groupthink piece, it comes back to something that Rob has mentioned a couple of times. If you're a journalist, it's expected to turn out 5 stories a day. And say if you're working in reporting on the tech world, and of those 5 stories, you may want 2 or 3. Maybe your editor may say, actually, no, we want 5 exclusive to us, or at least not exclusive to us, but we know that we are breaking in conjunction with a handful of other outlets. Then you are very dependent on the access that you are getting from some major corporations to feed you news. And if you were churning out 5 stories a day, your ability to build long-term contacts outside of that sort of PR communication world is restricted. It's hard. It takes many years, and if you're a journalist on the IP beat at a major media outlet, you might not be on it for that long, because although it's very important to us and what we're reporting on, it may be a first step to other jobs. And so, therefore, if you are dependent on certain companies giving you news stories, that is going to, although you might try to be straight down the middle in how you report it, it does make you more amenable to certain narratives.
I just want to just interject for just a quick moment to say that, we invited these particular reporters because they are respectable. I rely upon Tony and Richard's reporting in the patent space myself. I appreciate the work that you guys do and how you work hard at trying to ensure that information is conveyed with all of the competing narratives and rhetorical fights that are occurring in these policy spaces, given the high level of divisions and strong disagreements. So thank you, and thank you for your willingness to come here today and to talk and to get questions from the audience and from us. I know you're not used to being the people asked, so I appreciate it very much. Yes, over here.
Rob Aronoff with the International IP Commercialization Council. So question for the panel, especially Richard. One of the things you were talking about a second ago was that corporate access matters, and that helps color the what comes out the other end, the narrative. So does money. And so it's not a surprise to anybody here in the audience that Google and Apple have tons of money, and they are pushing their narrative, and they pushed both on the copyright side and on the patent side to lower the barriers to their access to innovation and to copywritten materials and such. And at the same time, they are major contributors, sponsors, advertisers in your publications. So how are, going back to the topic, improving public understanding in the policy discussion. You are reporters, you care about a healthy, balanced marketplace, and yet there's a clear agenda by one or more of your major advertisers, sponsors, partners pushing. How are you navigating all that?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, my official response would be there is, and it is, right, there is a Chinese wall between what happens in editorial and what happens on the sales side, and we always have to, and we do. I mean, that's just the way it is. If someone starts to talk to me about sort of the business side of things, and I said, well, that's got nothing to do with me. And, you mentioned, one company that has advertised with us at some of our events, and I would hope and I would say that if you read our reporting of them, that it would be the same. We treat them with the same skepticism as we would anyone else. Now you can go back and look at our archive and get in touch with me, and then we can have that conversation again. But I think our record would show that to be true. Now we report on, if you take, say, Google, they do it less now, and they have done for the last year or so, but they had a spate of putting out a bunch of IP value creation type projects, initiatives, IP3, which they're behind the sort of way of purchasing patents. And, I remember writing a story on that, and I think it's, it was worth saying, and we do put at the end, there are significant parts of the patent community that will raise their eyebrows at them doing this, other companies doing this, given some of the feelings and the narrative around what they are sort of perceived to have done to patent rights in the US over the last decade.
I think, first of all, talking about narratives, I don't think anyone in the media sits around trying to create a narrative. I don't think that's the way it works. I think that if I gave anyone that impression, I'm sorry. I think it's more about I think everyone sees every story through some kind of frame, whether they want to or not. That's just the way people are wired in some way. I believe in objectivity in the sense that it's a good goal for a lot of people a lot of the time, but it's sort of hard to get there because, we all have our unconscious biases. I don't think you can help it. I don't think, to the extent that companies influence the debate, I don't think it works. I think it works more subtly than that. Billboard has advertisers who are rights holders and advertisers who are tech companies. I've actually, when I worked there, I talked to people. I haven't talked to anyone on the ad side of Billboard since 2009. They never bother me. No one's ever asked me to change anything. There were times when YouTube complained about what I wrote to my editor. They said, we're complaining to your editor. I said, here's his number. They called my editor, and my editor said, they complained about you. And I said, I know. And he said, are you sure you're right? I said, yeah, I'm sure I'm right. And he said, you sure you can back this up? And I said, yeah, I can back this up. That was the last I heard of it. There's not pressure that way. But let me give you another scenario. Let's say I'm a general assignment business reporter for the Chicago Tribune. There's a big patent fight in Chicago court. I'm a general interest business reporter. What do I know from patents? I call up a couple college professors. In journalism school, they tend to say, call a professor. Litigators are on court. Professors, a lot of times, are in their offices. Professors are great sources. You're doing good stuff, but you're more often within range of the phone than a practicing attorney. Academics are very influential on journalists. I don't think there's any kind of weird conspiracy there. I just think, who do you, a lot of times when I'm writing about something that I'm not familiar with, which I do less just because of what I've been doing, I look for the authoritative book and I call the person who wrote it. Some of this is standard journalism stuff, and it ends up a certain way. It's not on purpose. And there's also a certain amount of which way the air currents are blowing. Who is that guy, Martin Shkreli, who bought the patent? Am I saying his name right? What? Scarelli, yeah, who bought the Wu-Tang Clan album. You know, I think he's a bad guy because the Wu-Tang Clan's mad at him. I don't cover patents, so you don't need to worry. But I cover the Wu-Tang Clan a little, very little. You know, a lot of people are going to read one story about patents all year, and it's about this guy who, at best, I don't understand, I really don't understand patents. The best thing you could say about him is that he's a jerk. I don't know anything more than that. Should that have any influence on the way anyone thinks? Of course not. It's one guy. Does it have some influence? Maybe a little. And also, when you talk about tech companies, it's less about anything I'm talking about, even in the general halo effect. You know, when nowadays, when politicians run for office, or not recently, but in 2012, I think everyone went to Google. I want my picture taken at Google. Why do they want their picture taken at Google? Because it's a marquee American company. 20 years ago, they wanted their picture taken at GM. That's not really, I don't know why. I mean, they could just get their picture taken in their own office. What do they say? You know, what do they go to Google? Do they show them the secret computer where the algorithm lives? I don't know what the hell they do there. But there's this sense that, like, there is a certain kind of stardust in Silicon Valley now. There's good reasons. I think those companies are tremendously innovative, and they're a great engine of growth for the economy. They do some things that are, you know, they're not friends, they're companies. All that, if you live in America and you say you're not influenced at all by that, I think you're probably lying a little. You have to be influenced by that. It's just what's out there. Journalists, like, you know, some newspapers, they sort of pretend that our journalists are like a team of monks, that, like, you know, they live in this hermetically sealed chamber where they're not influenced by the outside world. Life's not like that. Of course you're influenced by the outside world. You can't help it. I think it's just sort of what's in the air. And that's turning around now. Maybe that's unfair and maybe it's silly, but you're going to see it turn around.
Do you think the loss of personally identifiable information by so many tech companies has really been a driver for the change in the attitude toward, well, IP in general and copyright in particular? I guess it affects the whole news cycle.
Hell yes. I've covered privacy a bit in Europe and the U.S. and, like, I don't think a lot of and this is a very specific demographics. I don't think a lot of people in America knew what Equifax was until they lost all that data. And now they're like, wait a minute, who has all my data? Who said this is legal? Wait a minute, we're the only Western country without, I think the only Western country without a data protection law? What? People just weren't thinking about it. And now they're like, wait a minute, they can do that? Facebook has information that comes from outside Facebook? They're looking at stuff in the real world and matching it with stuff on Facebook? People, all of this feeds in. I don't know how much and how it works. It's really, and I'm not sure it's possible to know. But yeah, it has an effect. You gave all that information to Yahoo, and it's starting to seem like they just sort of, you know, they left it under the front doormats. The neighbors could take it while they were away. You trust these companies. You want to believe that they're run by people who take. You want to believe that they're run by people who take that responsibility really seriously. When Zuckerberg said, like, I think it's crazy that any ads on Facebook influence the election. Here's a guy who goes around marketing ads to politicians, and then he said it's crazy that it influenced the election. Whether you believe it influenced the election or not, I have no idea. I think it probably didn't. He doesn't take it that seriously. Think about the information Facebook has. You want him to feel the weight of that on his shoulders. This is an awesome responsibility. I have everyone's secrets. And he's just sort of like, I'm going to go to Iowa and have dinner with some people who seem sort of interesting. That's really, most people see that in a damning way. It may be illogical, but it's definitely true.
Tony or Richard? Do you have any? No? I had a whole set of questions to ask them, but the audience has been asking them. The questions about how do you cover controversial topics, and what's the relationship between the increased attention on intellectual property in the media and its attention in Congress and in the courts. But perhaps a question that hasn't been asked yet that I'd like to throw out to you as we're nearing the end is maybe you can give us a sense of how you select issues you report on, because there's hundreds and hundreds of cases every day. There's massive numbers of IP policy fights on many, many different issues. I mean, I can easily rattle off just in patent law, my area specialization, 20 issues that are currently hot topic fighting issues right now. And that doesn't include copyright and trademark and trade secrets and all that stuff. So maybe can you give us a sense of how do you talk with do you reach out to specialists? Do you wait to read on blogs, or what become the bases or the sources of information for you and how you select articles?
So-
Outside of the obvious ones like Supreme Court hands down opinion.
Yeah, sure. So we are, IM is slightly different to, say, to other trade mags, in that we are interested principally in how companies create value from their intellectual property, and really that's about patents. So we have that prism through which we see everything. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously there are some stories that I'm going to cover, Tony's going to cover, everyone's going to cover, oil states coming out of the Supreme Court, for example. That's going to be front and center. My editor's going to want to know, okay, well, how should our readership be viewing that? Then I very sadly have a look at all the cases that are hitting the district court the day before or the day of. So use something like Lex Machina. I'm constantly checking USPTO assignment databases for transfer of assets, for example, because there is always, you can go down the rabbit hole and see companies selling things, MPs picking things up, and if you can draw lines and connect the dots, which you can do as you become more experienced, then that's a great help. The other thing is, like you said, is speaking to people on a regular basis, finding out what is front and center for them. And so, for example, I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was at the annual IPO meeting, speaking to people there, and there was a lot of interest in a little-known, a little-known case to me, Planet Blue, which was going to hit the federal circuit, lip-syncing technology, and the software industry all wanted to know how it was going to go, because they didn't have a clue what was going on in 101 post-Alice. And so when you get people in-house in Microsoft and elsewhere starting to say, oh, this case is very interesting to us, it's immediately on your radar, and you're waiting for that decision, or the oral arguments and decision to come down.
Interesting. Tony?
Yeah, I agree with most of that. First of all, I think 80 to 90% of what we publish is event-driven, so an opinion comes down. We can be occupied for that for a while. I'll give myself some credit in that I look at something that is under the radar and I say, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right, and so I'll dig into it. But what you are always doing is contacting sources and saying, how did this happen? Why did this happen the way it did, and should I be prepared for the next step in this? And that's the only thing I really wanted to add is a lot more of what I do right now is look at what's about to come up and then go around and ask people, is this hot? Is this something that could possibly turn one way or another? And then I'm prepared when that event comes up. And the decision could come one way or another, or Congress could think about it one way or another, or the PTO could put out something one way or another. Then I'm prepared for it, and it looks like I've just uncovered a hot thing, but it's something that people told me about a month ago or something like that. So a lot more of what I do now is ask what's hot, what's going to be hot.
My situation's a bit odd because I'm doing a few things at once. I'm working on a book proposal. I'm a freelancer. I'm doing some stuff about privacy, some stuff about copyright. I'm very fortunate that I have a bit of freedom to to the extent I cover copyright, I can do a lot of stuff. I have some freedom to do what I want. At Billboard, the general attitude toward copyright is, it's really complicated, it's easy to get things wrong. I hope Levine can deal with it. And that goes double, I think, for the stuff in DC. You know, people, it's a lot of, you know, it used to be, if you think about covering the music business a while ago, publishing was really complicated. The music retail business was relatively easy. You're getting into more and more complicated IP stuff, and there's a sense that it's sometimes a bit up for grabs, and someone can grab it. It's a little more idiosyncratic and less systemic than a lot of you probably think. I think that's true of a lot of newspapers too. Like, if something's a really interesting story, like Blurred Lines, it might get a lot of coverage. Whereas ASCAP and BMI and the consent decree, something that's really important, Billboard cover, it doesn't get that much coverage in the mainstream media because it's just like, it's really hard to understand. And that's, I think, a lot of people in the business who are close to these issues think that's really annoying, and I get that, but it's sort of, you know, imagine you're a journalist and you're trying to explain this to your general interest business editor. Okay, so there's these PROs, they collect public performances. So people are performing songs in public. Well, it's not like a public performance, like someone's performing in public. It's like a legal public performance. You know, I'm fascinated by this stuff. I wrote a book and I kept writing about it because I really enjoy it. I really like it, but it's hard to make it accessible. And I think that the difficulty of making it accessible tends to shape how people write about it in a weird way. Like, oh, I need a character. I need a narrative. And the more complicated something is, the more you tend to look for characters. That's just, I think that's human nature. I'm not really enthusiastic about it, but I think it's sort of human nature.
All right. Well, we're coming up on the end of our time, so I really want to thank Richard and Tony and Rob for their willingness to get up here in front of an audience and talk about the work that they do and answer questions more generally about their industry and their profession. As I mentioned, I'm an avid reader of Richard and Tony's work because they write in patent law. I'm sorry, Rob, I really hate Robin Thicke, so I don't read Blurred Line articles.
He doesn't like you either.
So, but I know of your work and I've enjoyed your book. So
Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you to the audience for asking some good hard-hitting questions, and we'll take our break now.